Between preschool and adolescence, we have the important stage of middle childhood. Our children are now between 6 and 12 years of age, and it's a time, we said, where so much happens. It's a tremendous, important time because of the great impact which all that happens around the child, around the home, that impact has upon the child. And so there are many possibilities to do things together particularly, which we said gives that feeling of belonging which the child so much longs for and so much needs during this time. Now what I'd like to do at this time is to discuss with you some of the characteristics then of middle childhood. What are some of the primary characteristics of middle childhood? I hope you can think also of others beyond these. One, and the primary one, is the great need for affection. And here I like to start where I try to always start, and that is the relationship of father and mother to each other. This is really the key. That is, a child that senses a love between mother and father is a child that is quick to pick up also that affection, that love, that relationship which the child needs, and understands something about the security, the sacredness of life that I think can be found in no other setting. Charlie Shedd, I think it was, popularized the phrase, the best thing a man can do for his children is to love their mother. The love of father and mother for each other. This is so strong that psychiatrist Justice S. Green says that in my 25 years of practice, I have yet to see a serious adjustment in the life of a child where mother and father loved each other and whose love for the child was an outgrowth of their love for each other. Now, always when I say that, I realize that sounds so absolute. And yet, to remind you of the qualifier, he says whose love for the child is an outgrowth of their love for each other. Or as David Goodman says, your child will smile at you and later at the world if you too never cease smiling to each other. So I begin, when I talk about affection and the relationship of the parent to the child, I like to begin with also talking about mother and father's relationship. Or a phrase I've used time and time again is this one: parenthood is passing. The partnership is permanent. So keep the partnership in good repair, and parenting will take pretty good care of itself. I believe that very much. And again I say, when children sense the love, the stability, the sacredness, and the security of mother-father relationship, then they need perhaps very few words many times as to what the meaning of life is, or even relation to God, the love of God, the meaning of human love, the sanctity of sex, and all the rest, when they see it right there between father and mother. But when I say that also, then I say the child needs to hear words of love, and the child needs to see actions of love. That is, between mother and father, also between parent and child. Dr. Wanda Walker made a study of maladjusted teens in a large Oklahoma high school. Worked with maladjusted, handicapped in some ways in their emotional lives with teens. And the question they asked finally after they built a relationship with these teens is, when did your parents last tell you that they loved you? Not one of those students could ever remember parents say, I loved you. And that one could not remember when it was. Then they went in and they selected what They were told, well, here's some of the best adjusted teens in the high school. They asked the same question. When was it that your parents last told you that they loved you? Every last one of these teens said, yesterday, this morning, before I left school, showing the significance of those words and the relationship in the parent-child relationship. Now, I mention that because that kind of relationship of expressions of love must begin, of course, before the teen years. As a good many of the things we want to talk about begin early, before the teen years begin. The child in middle childhood is a child who longs for affection, needs and longs as well for the warmth of relationships in the life of the child and between parents and child in particular. The second characteristic of early childhood is it's a great age of feeling. That is, not only is the child more aware now of what is happening all around the child, but the child also is assessing the feelings that go along with what is happening. The feelings that accompany what is being said or done. So they can even from early childhood really accent certain words that maybe they don't hardly understand because of the feeling that's in back of those words, you see. The importance then of the tone of voice. I stress that oftentimes when it comes to husband-wife relationships. A mother one day heard her children playing in the living room. She noticed the noise getting louder and louder until she could stand it no longer. She went to the living room door and said, "Now, stop all this argument. How many times have I told you that argument like this never gets you any place? Now stop it." Only to have one of the little ones say, "But Mother, we're not arguing. We're just playing Daddy and Mama." And I suppose if you and I had gone to those parents and said, "Why do you argue like this?" They'd have been quick to say, "What do you mean arguing?" But the tone of voice which came through, you see, was powerful and caught the attention of the small child. And so it is that warm feelings in the family, in relationships, warm feelings toward our faith, toward others outside the home, in the way we talk about others, and all of this has primary meaning in the relationships right there, then in developing also this age of feelings, right feelings toward others, toward family, toward even those things which we believe. I remember as a boy of, I'd say 10 and 11, there was a woman in our community who took time out to read stories to a number of young fellows. I happened to be one of them. We called her Aunt Fanny. She read stories about characters of different. I remember her reading also animal stories, stories of heroes and the like. But I don't remember very many of those stories, but I do remember Fanny's reaction. I remember so clearly that large handkerchief which she had. And as she was reading, she was wiping tears at times, you see, from her eyes, because her feelings entered in so much to those stories. And that's what I remember from my middle childhood years of Fanny reading those stories. A sociology class, Johns Hopkins University, selected some years ago 200 children in a community, children which they felt were headed for crime and prison. They made a careful study of those 200 children. 25 years later, another class from Johns Hopkins University made a study again as they could find those persons as carefully as they could, and to find out really what had happened to them over the last 25 years. They found that there were only 2 out of those 200 who ended up with crime or prison. The thing which they heard repeatedly coming through was the name Aunt Hannah. Aunt Hannah would come through. They learned that this woman who showed affection and love to these young people in that community exerted such a powerful influence upon those young people that she changed practically a whole generation, you see, of young people because she met that need. Love changed the course, and so feelings. Feelings, many times more than words, are those which will have meaning to the child. Those will accompany, you see, the acts and things which we do and say. So, it's a great age of feeling. The third thing I want to say by way of characteristics is that sometimes we call middle childhood a period of latency. That means that there are things going on underneath that we may not notice on the surface. There is in middle childhood a time of kind of inner peace. Things are going well. And I say again that during this time, parents are inclined to relax, perhaps too much. I say they assume everything is going fairly well. The children are beyond the complications of babyhood and early childhood. And we need to realize that the development which is going on is a kind of subsurface level. The kind of relationships which the middle child will have later on as they hit the teen years and beyond depends so much on what goes on here. I talked about parents being close to each other. Also, as parents take time to be close to the child, to do things together. And if parents do not have time for their children during middle childhood, they can hardly expect their children to have time with them in the later life, particularly during those teen years. The child during middle childhood is then sensing all that is going on around the child. And if you know your child, the child is really sensitive to what others are saying, what others are doing, what is happening here, and will bring those stories home from school, share those things with you. And we say they are filing those away for future reference. Filing them away and remembering them in very, very clear terms. A fourth characteristic of early childhood or middle childhood is what I call the imitation stage. The child is a great imitator. They even call themselves at times copycats, you know. The early childhood years, say 1 through 5, I've called the age of regulation. That is, rules will never be more important in the life of the child than in the first 5 years of the child's life. If the child does not learn early where those boundaries are, that child will become a very insecure child. The child will kick and kick and kick until they feel the boundaries. And if they don't find them, finally they kick until the law finds them, you see. Very early, the child needs rules, and that's the primary way in which we guide. When I say that, I need to say this yet, that I'm not talking about a long list of rules. I'm talking about those few rules that will be important in your family, in my family, and to have a consistency in following through with those rules. So the early age is an age of regulation. When you come to about age 6, of course, then you're moving into what I call the imitation stage. And the primary way in which we guide now, although rules will always be important, is by modeling. And parents, again, being the primary modelers for the child. Imitating others whom the child admires. And either we provide those models or the child is very quick to find those models, whether on TV, movies, or in the community, in school, and the like. Parents, I want to stress, are the primary models, but here's where club leaders can be awfully important. Here's where teachers in school or in Sunday school can be tremendous importance, much more than they realize many times as their models. Here's where neighbors have their influence on the child because the child loves to imitate, copy those whom the child admires. The next characteristic of middle childhood is the great need for encouragement. Now, all of us need encouragement. We never outgrow that need. But I think particularly during middle childhood, we need to remember to encourage. It's the great corrective to behavior. The main reason why the child wants to be good is not for fear of punishment. The main reason the child wants to be good is because of encouragement on the part of parents primarily again. Dr. George Crane, who's an author and social psychologist, said it this way: the art of praising is the beginning of the fine art of pleasing. I remember the story, heard not very long ago, of a certain teacher who noticed a little girl coming to school who seemed to have the same dirt on her hands day after day, probably a neglected kind of little child. And she said to her one day, "Dear, you have beautiful hands. Let's go and wash them." And so she took her to the restroom. They washed her hands. And again, she complimented her on her beautiful hands. She began to notice that that little girl came to school every day a little cleaner as she complimented her, until she said she was one of the cleanest girls in her entire class. A little bit of encouragement. Again, let me share an experiment. A psychologist selected a group of what were considered average students. They took these students to the teachers and said, "These students have a very high IQ. These students have a great future ahead." And they persuaded these teachers that these were outstanding persons. And the next year or so, they were treated just that way. And actually, it had a tremendous effect, they said. Actually, everyone did excel, far above the average, because the teachers took that attitude in instructing and encouraging them. I was out in Illinois some time ago, and after a session such as this, a woman, now maybe 50, 55 years of age, came to me. And she said, "You know, when I was a little girl, first grade, I came home from school, I was playing with my dolls, and I was singing one of the songs that I learned in first grade. My mother came into the room and she said, 'Dear, you have a beautiful voice.' This lady said, I heard my mother say that day, and I went on to major in music, and I've taught music all my life." The power of encouragement. Benjamin West, the painter, tells how he became a painter. He said, "One day my mother needed to go to the grocery store rather suddenly. She left me at home with my sister Sally. While she was gone, I found the colored ink in the cupboard, and I began to paint my sister Sally's portrait. When my mother came home, she ignored the ink that was splattered across the table. She leaned over my shoulder, looked at my painting, and said, Why, that's Sally," and gave me a kiss. Benjamin West said, "My mother's kiss that day made me a painter." Sir Walter Scott became known around the world. And yet I'm told that when he was a small boy, really in his early grades, he was considered a dullard. And what they did with fellows like that those days was to put them in a corner. And so he was put in the corner of the schoolroom with a dunce cap on his head. But one evening, Walter Scott was in a home where famous literary characters were being entertained. The then very famous Robert Burns was among those characters. During the evening, Burns walked over to a picture that he saw on the wall that contained a couplet from a poem. He asked who wrote it, and no one in that room knew. And then a young boy stepped up to his side, told him who wrote the couplet, and repeated the rest of the stanza. And Burns leaned over, put his hand on his shoulder, and said, Barney, thee will be a great man in Scotland someday." And history says that from that moment on, Walter Scott was a different boy. I was in Winnipeg, Manitoba some time ago. I told that little story, and a man came to me afterward and said, "I just returned from the country over there where I saw that 6-story building dedicated to Sir Walter Scott, known around the world." Praise the child. Find every moment, every happening, everything you can to praise the child for what the child can help. I say it that way because sometimes parents have said to me, well, if you praise the child, won't you build pride in the child or wrong self-concept maybe? I say, no, not as long as you praise them for what they can help. To praise them for blue eyes or curly hair, something they have no control over, might well build that kind of self-conceit or pride. But anytime we can praise the child for what they've done well, for good behavior, we can only encourage that which all of us so much desire. Now let me give you an illustration how it can at times work the other way, and I could give numerous ones of these. Perhaps you could too. I grew up watching a man whom all of us respected very much. In fact, in our church, if we would, as teenagers even, have anybody to suggest to be our teacher, we'd likely suggest this man. But I watched him as a leader in the church. He would open the songbook, follow the song that was being sung, but he never sang. I knew he loved music, and yet he never sang. I wondered many times, why not? Some time ago, I was in that community again, and I stopped at a retirement home where this man now is in his middle 90s. And there, as we chatted together that day, out of the blue, he told me this: "John, when I was a boy, I was part of a children's choir." Well, my ears perked up. And then he went on and said this. He said, "But one day, while we were practicing, the choir director said, 'Somebody in this choir is off tune.'" And he said, I was a very sensitive little fella. I didn't sing the next song. She didn't say anything more. And then, after a little pause, he said very sadly, John, that was the last song I ever sang. The power of negative, at the right psychological moment, we say, can also have a detrimental kind of experience. But I want to stress the fact that middle childhood, in particular, is a time to praise the child at every opportunity we can find, and to beware of the negatives, which are inclined to disappoint and have impact beyond what we many times realize. Another one that I think you'll agree with if you have a child in middle childhood is that a characteristic of middle childhood is that they are active and noisy. It's hard for them to sit still. If they're normal at all, it's pretty hard. Not only that, they will practice endlessly at some skill many times, which says something to us about opportunity to teach them proper skills and the like, to encourage them. So it's a great time to develop some hobby. It's a great time to be with them, and rather than simply sitting hours before a TV or playing with a little game that's also one-way kind of communication, to spend times to communicate, to talk together, and to play together in a very active time of life, a time where they just love to participate, with parents in particular, to have them join in. Another outstanding characteristic of middle childhood is the great need for belonging. Now, how is belonging developed? Well, belonging is primarily developed by doing things together. I heard a report just in the last few weeks that today teenagers say that one of the thoughts uppermost in their minds, more than any other, is suicide. Suicide among teens has tripled in 25 years. And the answer they gave as to the reason why it has tripled the way it has is that teens do not have a sense of belonging anywhere. Secondly, that their parents are off doing things on their own. They're doing their own thing instead of spending time with their children. Now, the time to spend with your children is not going to happen very readily when they hit the teens. That's when they're trying now to find their own identity, you see. Now is when they need to have a certain amount of independence. But the time when they begin to build the sense of belonging, and that's strengthened, is during the middle childhood years, when they love to belong. They love to belong to the family. They love to belong to the group, you see. Doing things together. Don't expect a sense of belonging later on if it is not developed during the middle childhood years. And so that's why I say the right kind of clubs can be awfully important. A vital Sunday school class, even for children in this age group, can be tremendously important. One of our little grandchildren came into our house a little while back just crying her heart out. Betty said, "Well, what is the matter today?" And she said, "Well, they told me that I don't belong with their group." Here she was playing with another group, and they were, like they do sometimes, sort of nastily, push them out and say, "You don't belong." And her heart was broken over that kind of experience. They have the need to belong. The need of the small group of intimate friends are awfully important during these middle childhood years. The next one is that middle childhood is characterized by a love for adventure. That is, they have interests beyond themselves, and they're interested in doing many things, call it some adventure or another. I have to admit, I admire our daughters Sandy and our son-in-law John, who a few weeks ago decided that they were going to take a trip to San Francisco. They had ridden their bicycles as young people across Canada one summer. 4,600 miles they had on bicycle. Then they rode down the west coast on their bicycle on their honeymoon. Then they dipped their bikes into Los Angeles and rode from there to Virginia Beach. And they said, we want to take our Jonathan and Maria, Jonathan 7, Maria 9, back to some of the haunts which we enjoyed so much on the West Coast. So they took the children for a week in the San Francisco area, and they showed us the pictures which they took, the movies and the like. And the children were simply overjoyed as they took them to one spot or another and told them what they did here, took them, up those trolleys, the steep hills of San Francisco and the like, and left them watch the streets out of their hotel windows and the like. Those children will never forget those kinds of togetherness experiences and the adventure of those times together, as they saw those animals, as they saw those fish, as they saw the seals and all of those things. The child loves to do things with adults. And so camping, fishing, swimming, playing. Join hands now, and you will likely have teens later who will be more readily to join hands with you. A father some time ago was playing with his son. Another who knew him and knew that he was tired said, why are you taking time out to play? I know you've had a hard day. And he said, listen, I'd rather have a tired back now than a broken heart later. So when the child loves adventure, and loves at that point yet to do adventurous things with parents, well, that gives you some of the characteristics of middle childhood, which one can build upon, of course, and I hope can be helpful in your own experience today.